Thank you. Thanks, Bill. And first, let me say, well, maybe I'll end up acting out some of my pictures, or I'll try describing when I get to the appropriate spots, but I think we can do just fine without them. Let me say first how pleased I am to be here as a representative of the Organization of American Historians. Also, that I'm pleased to be here as an individual historian, and also to have this opportunity to talk about one of my favorite topics. And also, I'd like to give special thanks to Bill and all the help he gave in arranging this talk and my visit here. So as you've heard, the general topic here is gender and the Civil War, specifically why gender matters for understanding the Civil War and for getting a richer and fuller picture of the Civil War. And when I say gender, I should just sort of explain a little bit by way of some definitions. What I'm talking about is a particular way of thinking about sex roles in society, what society believed was appropriate and inappropriate for men and women, how men and women did certain things or believed in certain things based on how they understood what those gender roles were supposed to be. So it means that in this talk, I'm not just going to be talking about women, I'm also going to talk about men. I should say I'm also not just going to be talking about one side or the other in this war, but I'll talk about both Northerners and Southerners. And in fact, I might even spend a little bit more time talking about Northern women than either Southern women or men in either section, not only because I've written specifically about Northern women, but also I've come to appreciate that Northern women have been sort of overlooked in the scholarship on the Civil War, and they're sort of underplayed in terms of their significance and importance in the war. Because Southern women really have always occupied, I think, a very special place in the study of the Civil War. There's always been this sense that the Civil War had this meaning and significance in the lives of Southern women that wasn't true for Northern ladies. And we might call this whole notion about the importance of Southern women the Scarlet Syndrome. At this point, I would be showing you a picture of Scarlett O'Hara. Imagine in your heads a picture of Scarlett O'Hara. So we would, at this point, be talking about Scarlett. And Scarlett, I think, in many ways, even though she wasn't real, she's real to many people, and she has become emblematic, really, of the suffering that the South experienced during the war. She's become symbolic of the inhumanity of the Yankee onslaught, the way people in the South had to make do with so little. These were all sort of qualities that seemed to define the Confederate experience. And in fact, I would say over the years, Northern women have become the victims of a disease that I refer to as scarlet fever. Which is kind of this tendency to forget everything that Northern women did because of the blinding light of Scarlett O'Hara. And in fact, even where I teach in Boston, at Boston University, this problem of scarlet fever runs rampant. And so I ask you, I ask this question assuming that nobody's going to know the answer, but every now and then somebody does know the answer. Does anybody know the name of the Boston University mascot? Because sometimes, there are people who are interested in mascots and different school mascots, right? Now, of course, nobody knows the name of the Boston. Well, the Terriers are the team, that's right, but the mascot has a name. That's good, yeah. But the mascot actually has a specific name, and the mascot's name is Rhett. At this point, I would show you a picture of Rhett, but Rhett, and why? Why, of all things, at Boston University would the BU mascot be named Rhett? Well, because this is at least the way it was taught to me, no one loves scarlet, which is the BU color, more than Rhett. So, it's almost inescapable, the power of Scarlett O'Hara. And certainly it's true that Northern women were far removed from some of the central areas of conflict during the war. You can't really talk about women at Vicksburg. You can't really talk about, you can't talk about Northern women at Vicksburg. You can't talk about Northern women at Cold Harbor. And so for a long time, I think historians probably thought it wasn't all that interesting to know much about Northern women. They didn't think the experience of Northern women had all that much bearing on the Civil War. So one of my scholarly objectives has been to rescue Northern women from this kind of historical black hole that they seem to occupy, and to try to give some sense of how critical I think their role is in understanding the story of the Civil War. Again, though, I'm not just talking about Northern women for this talk. I'm not just talking about Southern women for this talk, but the larger theme is this one of gender. And in saying that gender matters for understanding the Civil War, I am not saying that gender trumps race. I'm not saying that gender is more important than slavery. I'm not saying gender is the most important factor that caused the war, or that the transformation of gender roles was more critical or more critical than the revolution in race relations that took place during the war or after the war. But what I am trying to understand is how gender, this whole range of ideas regarding sex roles, how this gives us a prism for understanding the sectional crisis in new ways, and how it gives us insight into some of the ideological conflicts and practical experiences of the time. And so, more specifically, and for the purposes of this talk, I want to consider how gender matters in three specific ways. One, I want to talk about how different notions of gender shaped the ideological differences that Northerners and Southerners articulated at the start of the war, so gender's role in creating ideological differences. Two, how different ideas about gender shaped the way Northern women and Southern women understood and experienced the war, so gender specifically as it relates to the things Northern and Southern women did. And then three, how our historical memory of the Civil War is very much a product of certain notions and practices related to gender. So let me start with the first point. That's always a good place to start. And to talk specifically about how different notions of gender shaped the ideological differences that Northerners and Southerners articulated at the start of the war. And to put this another way, what I'm really talking about is how gender relates to this whole question of cause. Right? How does gender help us understand the way Northerners understood their cause? How does gender help us understand the way Southerners understood their cause? So when I first began researching this topic about gender and the war, I was particularly struck by the language that men used when they were explaining, especially to friends and family at home, why they were fighting. So, for example, I found that Confederate men, these were soldiers, officers, slave owners, as well as non-slave owners, Confederate men would say things and hear things like this. This is a quote. "We have everything to fight for, our wives, children, land, and principles." Or they would say things like this. "The aid of every loyal son is now needed to defend the rights and honor of his political mother, where nestles the home of his wife and children, and where is deposited all his property for their support." In other words, this language suggested to me that Confederates very closely tied their understanding of the cause to homes and families, to their women, to their children, to their dependents, to personal property. That defending the Confederacy for many of these men seemed almost synonymous with the idea of defending your home and your family. And this seems like a fairly standard thing that soldiers everywhere talk about. I'm fighting for my family, I'm fighting for, you, my loved ones. And so it made me wonder, well, didn't Union soldiers also talk about fighting for their homes and families? Well, they did, but they did it in a very different kind of way, and they articulated that understanding of the cause in a very different way. So Union soldiers, in contrast to Confederates, said things like this. "Home is sweet and friends are dear, but what would they all be to let the country go to ruin?" Some of them said things like this to their wives and their families. "My duties to my country are of more importance now than my duty to you." In other words, it seemed to me that Union soldiers were making a sharper distinction between the cause of the country and the cause of the home. And unlike the Confederates, not only were they separating the two, but they had priorities, and they were ranking those priorities, and they were putting the country first, and they were putting home and family second. Now, to a certain extent, this made sense. Strictly from a geographical point of view, it made sense. The Confederates felt they had to protect homes and families from invading Yankees, right? That they were protecting a home front in a very real sort of way. But I also think there was more to their language than just this idea of fending off an invasion from outside attackers. Because the Confederates, I found, were talking in these terms before the war begun. They spoke in these terms when they were trying to discuss and explain the way of life that they were trying to protect. So that they didn't use it just in terms of protecting particular things or protecting particular places, but they also used this language to talk about the kind of social structure they were preserving, the kinds of ideas that were important to them. It was a way of really talking about what they saw was fundamental to the whole enterprise they were fighting for. And in a way, it seemed to me that the struggle that they were trying to articulate here and what they were trying to explain was what it meant to be a man, or really what it meant to be a Southern white man, or a white man in the antebellum South. And then that was, to a great extent, when they were talking about, what they were defending and what they were fighting for, it was another way of articulating what was important to them and what defined them as Southern white men. Which begs the question, what did it mean to be a white man in the antebellum South? Well, I would argue that a Southern white man in this period had to uphold a certain place of authority with respect to women, children, and other forms of property. That was the framework that they were operating out of. More specifically, I would say that these men operated within the context of a particular gender ideology. And that particular gender ideology placed them as part of a plantation-based patriarchal society in which their power as white men came from being masters over their homes. Right? That's what they were talking about. This idea of defending their position as masters over their homes. And when I use the word master here, I'm using it in terms of a general sense of authority. I'm not just talking about the slave master. I'm not just talking about the Southern white man who was a slave owner. In fact, as one historian argues, the average yeoman farmers of the South also thought of themselves as masters, not because they owned slaves, and many of them did not own slaves, but because they saw themselves as independent men who controlled their own resources and directed their own actions, right? And so they were in control of a particular set of resources, land, property, and dependence. And when they talked about being masters over their homes, they were not using that word home in a narrow sense. They weren't using it simply to talk about a building where family members resided, but really what they were talking about was their property, the land, and everything that sustained their family. Now, in contrast, I would say that Northern men articulated a very different sense of what it meant to be a man, there was a different notion of what it meant to be a figure of authority. And I'll come back to this and say more about it, but it seems to me that Northern men, especially in the 1860s, found their source of authority not in this home, but in something outside the home, in a marketplace, in a place of commerce, in a place of business, in some kind of workplace that took them away from a home or a household. And certainly many of them owned land, certainly many of them owned property, but their landowning did not have quite the same self-contained quality or self-sustaining quality that it had in the South. So in the South, I would say that it was this self-contained nature of property ownership, which meant that Southern white men, and here I mean slave owners as well as non-slave owners, tended to see themselves as masters over a personal and localized domain. Right? And obviously, if they were slave owners, they derived a sense of identity and standing from controlling the labor of slaves. But again, I would say even non-slave owners understood their own status and their place in society in terms of property ownership, the land that they owned, and their ability to control the labor of their dependents. Maybe it wasn't slaves, but to a certain extent, they were able to control the labor of their family members. And they exercised authority over their family members. They were also, I would say, able to pass property on to their sons. So not only did a Southern man control his own property, but he could ensure the manhood of his sons because he would pass property on to them. And I think this is the basic principle that is present in the way Confederate soldiers talked about their cause. Because what I would say was important to them, what was most important to them, was preserving a particular way of life, preserving their position as masters over what was basically an independent domain, something that they could control themselves and sustain themselves. It was a kind of broadly defined home and family. It was a home that included, as I said, not just this building, but the property around it. It was a family that might have included their immediate family, might have also extended to slaves. But this was what they controlled, and this was the thing that they were trying to preserve. And they wanted to make sure that nobody could interfere with their ability to exercise authority over that domain. Now, as I've already suggested, Union men talked about very different things, and they sounded very different when they talked about their causes. Union soldiers made a clear separation between fighting for women and families as opposed to fighting for a national enterprise. They did not blend those things together. And even more, they tended to rank those things, and they placed the nation on a higher level than the home. Duty prompts me to go, explained one Michigan soldier. My country first, home and friends next. Another Union soldier, was particularly blunt when he said, first my God, second my country, third my mother. Which may not be a nice thing to hear if you were his mother. But it does suggest that Union men felt a stronger commitment to an abstraction that they called country, to an abstraction that they understood as this nation that stood above home and family. And again, geography plays a role here. Union men were going off to subdue an enemy in this relatively far-off place. It meant that the language of protecting their own home and family, didn't lend itself to the same extent as it did to Southerners. But I think it is also true that home and family did not define who those Northern men were in the same way that it defined who Southern men were. Because Northern men derived authority, as I was saying before, more from things outside the home, not because they controlled a certain amount of land, not so much because they controlled a certain amount of personal property, but because they had certain positions in a marketplace, in the stores, in the banks, in the workshops, in other places of economic exchange. So for them, the place where they derived a sense of identity really stood outside the home. Even more, I would say, in the North at this time, the idea of the home itself was becoming more and more narrow. It did not encompass a man's livelihood. In fact, the home was becoming a place that was more and more associated only with women. It was the place where women did chores. It was a place where women nurtured and raised children. But more and more, the home was not a place that produced real, tangible economic wealth. It was not the place where you got cash income. You went someplace else in order to get that economic wealth. And as numerous women's historians have explained, this fact, this thing that was the way that the home was sort of decreasing in significance and importance was making it seem less substantial, or to use one historian's phrase, the home was becoming more and more pastoral. So, where Southern men looked toward the home, That is this broadly defined home that encompassed domestic living arrangements as well as economic production on the land. This was the source of their identity and manhood. Northern men were more and more viewing the home, as they would have called it at the time, as woman's sphere, right? The Southerners did not use that idea to the same extent. It didn't mean as much to them to call the home woman's sphere, because I think to a great extent the home was everybody's sphere. Whereas in the North, there was more this sense that the home was woman's sphere and things outside the home were men's sphere. It means, in other words, that it was not that much of a stretch for Northern men to rank the nation higher than the home, because this idea of the separate spheres had already accustomed them to this idea of ranking the home lower than other public pursuits. They'd already made this separation in their minds, that the home was the woman's sphere, other things were men's sphere. They already had accustomed themselves to this idea that women's sphere was less important. So if all of this tells us something then about how gender affected the way Northerners and Southerners articulated their cause, I want to move on to point number 2, which is how these distinctive notions of gender affected the way Northern and Southern women experienced the war and how they thought about the war. So one thing we can say, based on the way these two sides imagined their cause and talked about what they were fighting for, we can say that Unionists, the men in the North and the women in the North, because they had extricated this idea of a nation and separated it from the personal defense of home and family, I think it meant that in the Union they were able to articulate a stronger sense of nationalism than the Confederates. In other words, in the Union, they had to think about nationalism as something separate from homes and personal property. Right? They had actually elevated it to a special place that required them to think about it and give allegiance to it. Given that, I think it also means that Northern women also developed a stronger sense of national belonging, as well as a stronger civic and political identity than Southern women did. In fact, even before the war, we can already see that Northern women were developing a stronger attachment to the whole idea of a nation than their Southern counterparts did. There was a more developed political infrastructure in the North in the 1850s. The government had a stronger presence, I think, in Northerners' lives than it did in the South, in the form of taxes, in the form of transportation, in various ways in which the government intervened in different lives. And to give you one very concrete example, we might consider public schools. In 1850, the Northern states had twice the white population of the Southern states, but they had 3 times as many public schools. And if we compare women's access to these public schools, the picture becomes even sharper. Because the South tended to be a more rural society, a more isolated society, generally it meant that education was a fairly low priority for most Southern white women. There's one estimate that suggests that 1 out of 5 Southern white women was illiterate. But by the 1840s, the Northern states had close to universal literacy for both men and for women. Now, the school is not simply a place where people learn how to read or to do figures. It's not simply a place where you might have a tangible expression of the government at work in your community, although it certainly is that. But school is also a place, if you think about, when you first go to a public school, often it's the first time you encounter patriotic rituals. You go to a public school, it's often the first time, that you are taught the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, you're taught certain patriotic poems, you're taught patriotic hymns, the flag is raised. And in fact, in the northern states in the period before the Civil War, there's a good chance that a northern woman was herself the instructor of those patriotic values, that she was herself teaching children those patriotic rituals and memorizing the Declaration of Independence or the rituals associated with the flag. Because it's right around this time that northern women were entering the teaching profession in very large numbers. In fact, about 1 in 5 women in Massachusetts had some teaching experience in the antebellum period. In the South, teaching was very much discouraged as a pursuit for Southern white women. So even through that very ritual, that process of being in the school, of being a teacher in the school, being students in the school, this was one way in which I think northern women became accustomed to the idea of nationalism in a way that Southern women did not. Even more, I would say that Union ideology, the whole notion of what the Union was fighting for, gave Northern women a stronger sense of belonging to the nation during the war itself. Now, on the one hand, it might seem counterintuitive to say that an ideology that ranked mothers third would also give women a keener sense of national belonging. But in fact, I think this is something that happens. I think the ideology that both men and women subscribe to on the Union side makes them feel more attached to a nation. Because women were repeatedly told that it was imperative that they support the Union cause, that they needed to understand that the Union was something that was more important and significant than their homes and their families, and that they needed to lend their support to that. So I think when Union women supported the war effort, it's like they were saying, yes, I support men's decision to go and fight, and in supporting that decision, I also agree that the nation ranks higher than the home, and so I will also give my support to the nation. And you can see a kind of tangible reflection of that because Northern women would repeatedly use phrases like, you're fighting for our country, you're fighting for my country, not simply talking about how you're fighting for your country, but they sort of took ownership of that idea of the national cause. Some of them were even more explicit about their commitment to the nation when they made the argument that their patriotism should be judged not in the way they thought it was being judged in the South, and they said, well, in the South, it's really simply a question of how much Southern women get out there and yell and scream and show their support for their men. But they said a different standard actually had to exist to judge women's patriotism, and they had to judge it based on how loyal women were to their country's ideals, how much they actually subscribed to the principles of the nation. The point, explained one woman writer, was not to viciously berate the enemy soldiers. It was not to rip up our fine dresses into bandages to help wounded soldiers, but it was to cultivate, quote, a healthy, intelligent patriotism in the social and domestic circles of our land. Right? So that for them, there was a very different standard of patriotism. For them, the standard of patriotism had to do with principles. It had to do with ideals. It was not about getting out and sewing things for simply, or it wasn't simply about sewing things for men. It wasn't simply about yelling at the enemy when they approached the enemy, but it had to do with subscribing to a certain set of ideals. Which is not to say that Confederate women failed to demonstrate their own form of patriotism. But I think that because Confederates talked so much about fighting for homes and for families, it became harder for white Southerners to really come to terms with what this whole notion of nationhood was all about. And so I think as a result, a more traditional standard prevailed in the South when it came to judging women's patriotism. And it had less to do with how much women supported national ideals. It had less to do with national principles. It had more to do with how much they sacrificed for the military needs of their men. Finally, I think we can also see that there were certain things that happened during the war itself that further strengthened Northern women's sense of national belonging. We can see this in terms of the federal government. The federal government began giving employment to women. They expanded several departments in the government and actually actively recruited women to be employees in various departments and bureaus. Perhaps of even greater importance was the pension system. The new pension law that was enacted in July of 1862 was actually directed directly at women. The new pension law increased the number of women who received monetary benefits as a result of having sacrificed men who had either been killed or seriously debilitated in the war. So in fact, the new pension law said, now more and more women will be brought onto the pension rolls for having sacrificed their husbands or male relatives. These benefits, in fact, were even extended to mothers and sisters of Union soldiers, as long as those mothers or sisters had been dependent on a soldier's income. And so by the end of the war, 3/4 of the government's pension payments went to widows and female dependents, not to former soldiers. And so this pension system, in fact, represented, I think, a very important shift in the way the federal government took responsibility, became a kind of activist state on behalf of its citizens, and in fact was directing its benefits and its welfare to a great extent to women specifically. And so if you imagine for a moment the repeated acts that women must have gone through of filling out their pension applications, appealing to government officials to get assistance, and then actually receiving month after month after month a pension check, this is a tangible link that many Northern women had to the nation and a sense of belonging to a national system. Closely connected to this was the fact that Northern women became more invested in the political system. And in fact, it makes sense. The more Northern women felt that they were connected to the government's policies, the more women felt that they were the recipients of things like a pension system, well, the more interest they took in national politics. And in fact, during the war, women everywhere began to show a heightened interest in party politics. And many of them, in fact, felt like now they actually had to show even more so that they had a political commitment because they had to fill in for men who would have been politically engaged, but those men couldn't be politically engaged because they were off in the war. So this was especially true, and you could see this in letters that men wrote back to women, that you have to stand up for the cause of the Union because now you're surrounded by men who didn't come to fight. And if you're surrounded by men who didn't come to fight, well, they must be our enemies. They must be disloyal. They must be, as the phrase went at the time, copperheads. And so, especially among Republicans, there was a sense that women on the home front had to express their political views in support of the war in order to kind of, almost to be sort of like surrogate political actors for the men who were fighting off on the battlefront. They couldn't be there to be political, so the women had to fill in and take that role for them. Both men and women seemed to embrace this idea that the times demanded greater input from women on political matters. I know ladies are not usually interested in such matters, but the time has come when they, as well as the sterner sex, must put a shoulder to the wheel, explained one Connecticut soldier to his wife. As this man saw it, putting, quote, a shoulder to the wheel could even include, as he put it, quote, spitting upon those who had anti-war leanings. Maddie Blanchard, one soldier's wife, agreed that women's political input was essential, but she hoped for a more effective political tool than spit. I think, she wrote to her soldier husband in March of 1863, they had ought to let the soldiers' wives vote while they are gone, don't you? So there is a sense that there's a real kind of political void almost that women could fill if they had more political tools at their disposal. And I think this kind of thinking actually kind of carries over into the period after the war. It carries over into a sense that women feel like we need more effective political tools in order to make our positions known. It opens up the discussion. It doesn't immediately lead to the enactment of suffrage, but it certainly opens up the discussion about suffrage and women's rights in the North in a way that is not true in the South. Okay, so far, what I have said has really looked only at white women. And I do want to say something about African American women. Although I should say that the question about African American men and women and how they relate to the stated and unstated causes of the Civil War is complicated and demands a lot more than the brief remarks that I can make here. But one thing I think is important to note, which is that when we talk about African Americans and what side they're going to fight for, who they're going to cast their loyalties with, well, you can imagine that when Confederates talk about bringing together the home and the family and the nation, certainly that was an ideology that carried very little substance or weight for most African Americans because the whole institution that the South fought for undermined the black home and the black family. And in fact, many Confederates saw the slaves themselves as part of the property that they had gone off to war in order to defend. On the other side, African Americans tended to support the Union cause, especially when the Union cause proclaimed itself in favor of protecting black homes and black families. But Union officials were often very inconsistent when it came to protecting black homes and families. And in fact, sometimes, Union officials seemed to be, as African Americans saw it, Union officials seemed as if they were simply replicating some of the conditions of slavery when they would separate black men from their families and insist that black men fight in the army, sometimes, forcibly dragging black men away from homes and families, in some instances to impress them into the army. One Northern teacher who was observing this when she was working in South Carolina during the war, said that the former slaves, quote, cannot but think that this is a queer way to treat free people. However, the Union idea of nationalism, I think, did carry real meaning for the slaves of the South the more it became enmeshed with the cause of emancipation. Now, that's obvious, but I think one way that Union officials made clear that they were committed to the idea of emancipation was when they demonstrated how much they were willing to preserve homes and families and protect black homes and families. And so one thing they did in order to show they were committed to black homes and black families was they promoted marriage. And they would allow former slaves to enter into legally recognized marriages. They would encourage former slaves to enter into legally recognized marriages. This became a very important function that the Union Army filled. And in fact, it was a widely discussed phenomenon how the Union war effort was making possible these new wedding ceremonies for the former slaves. And of course, the slaves themselves welcomed this opportunity to marry. It was a critical right that had been denied to them when they were slaves. But the way Union officials organized and allowed marriages, the way they privileged marriages in a certain kind of way, also allowed them to promote a certain kind of gender ideology. Because in fact, there were ways in which I think the Union officials and Union government used marriage as a vehicle to determine which black women got benefits and assistance from the federal government and which ones did not. In other words, what Union officials did was, because they were most interested in getting support from black men so that black men would serve in the army and that black men would support the Union war effort, they would extend benefits and aid to men regardless of their marital status. So they would give them direct federal assistance regardless of their marital status. Women, however, only got benefits when they were married to those men. And so when you think, and in fact, one of the things that happens during the war is there are thousands and thousands of displaced African American women who are trying to find their way to Union Army lines. Most of them, even if they considered themselves married at one point under slavery, have no way of proving their marital status. You can see that there was a way in which I think the Union policy and the officials of the Union government made a gendered distinction in terms of who would get certain benefits and who would not. Okay, the final point that I want to turn to is about this question of memory, and specifically about the way notions of gender have shaped the way we remember the war. So I've suggested, and I sort of already suggested something about this at the beginning of the talk, that Northern women have gone missing in our memory of the war, right? Certainly, Northern women pale in comparison to the Scarlett O'Haras, to the other women from the South who have sort of become emblematic of the Confederate experience. Just to give you one example of sort of the absence of Northern women, for every 3 Confederate soldiers' monuments that included a tribute to women, only 1 Union monument did the same. Right, so if you look at all the Civil War monuments that are scattered all over the country, and you find Confederate monuments obviously all over the South, well, they are much more likely to pay a tribute to Southern women than Union monuments are to pay to Northern women. And again, it's true that Northern women's relative distance from the action, from the central events of the war, perhaps made them less exciting as cultural icons. But that doesn't necessarily explain why Northern women have received so few tributes, so few commemorative accolades. So we might understand why they haven't been memorialized in that many movies, or why there's not a kind of Gone with the Wind equivalent for Northern women, but it doesn't explain why Northern soldiers have also neglected Northern women, why public officials also were neglecting Northern women after the war. So I want to suggest here a few reasons why I think Southern women have been sort of elevated in our memory of the war, and Northern women have been forgotten. First, and perhaps most importantly, I think there is a structural issue. Northern women, I think, were preempted from the memorial process at the end of the war. Because when Union soldiers died, the federal government came in and took care of the memorials and the burials. They came under the jurisdiction of the U.S. War Department, and the U.S. War Department created cemeteries for those soldiers. They maintained cemeteries for those soldiers. The federal government played a dominant role in terms of funding and building those cemeteries, in terms of burials and reburials of Union soldiers' bodies. But the federal government, for obvious reasons, were not that interested in dead Confederate soldiers. They tended to ignore dead Confederate soldiers. They weren't making a point of building a lot of special cemeteries and memorial markers for dead Confederate soldiers. And as a result, a door was opened for Southern white women to make that cause their own. Legislative enactment may not be made to do honor to the memories of fallen Confederates, said one Southern woman, but the ladies, she believed, can keep alive the memory of the debt we owe them. And in fact, as soon as the war ended, you can see the creation of hundreds and hundreds of ladies' memorial associations that were created throughout the South in the immediate years after the war, who overseed the burials, the reburials, and other commemorative activities for the Confederate dead. Right? Northern women did not have the same place in the burials and reburials of their soldiers because the federal government was doing that work. And even more, I think Southern women came to the forefront in that commemorative work because they were women. So in fact, they could give that work an air of political neutrality. Even if the ceremony was, in fact, a highly political ceremony in which they were paying tribute to the greatness and glory of the Confederate cause. But if women were in charge, they could say, well, no, this is really an act of sentiment. This is an act that has nothing to do with a political perspective. It simply has to do with memorializing our dead. And this is significant, when you consider the period immediately after the war, when any possible expression of hostility to the Union war effort could be read, after all the Union officials are occupying the South, in the period after the war. And so it was a kind of vehicle, I think, for expressing something political, but they could do it under the guise of women's sentiment. A second factor here, because Southern white women played such an important part in this memorialization, they could also make sure that they were themselves memorialized. So in these hundreds and hundreds of ladies' memorial societies, these women could take the initiative to write tributes to themselves. They could write tributes to other Confederate women. They could make sure that special plaques were erected to honor specific Confederate women, and they could encourage men to write tributes to women. And in fact, some of these tributes were less about what women had done for the original Confederate cause, and they were more about appreciating women who had helped to legitimize the Confederate cause and the Confederate veteran after the war was over. And the last point that I would make on this question of memorialization is that I think Southern white women came to occupy a very central place in Civil War commemoration because after the war was over, they seemed to embody the very essence of what the Lost Cause was all about. Long after the Civil War was over, the Southern woman Virginia Durr recalled being at a Confederate veterans reunion where she heard the veterans go on and on in their talk about, quote, pure white Southern womanhood. I got to thinking, she recalled, that I was pretty hot stuff to have the war fought for me. And in fact, in this kind of language that was used after the war was over, in the language that went on and on about the South's lost cause, this is the point that was emphasized, that the men of the South didn't fight to protect slavery, because the Lost Cause said slavery had nothing to do with the war. The Lost Cause said that Southern men fought to protect women. Now, in fact, this is precisely the language that Confederate men had used all along. This is the language they had used in 1861, that the defense of the home was first and foremost. And after the war, they continued to talk about this idea and uphold this idea that their cause was mainly about homes and families. But when they talked about the importance of homes and families in the period after the war, I think that obscures how the whole notion of home had changed from the pre-war period to the post-war period. Because the home for the South, after the war was over, was not the same slaveholding plantation it had been before the war. It was not the same kind of farm that had existed before the Civil War. But now it more closely resembled the Northern home. It more closely resembled that woman's sphere, that less economically productive sphere that was true of Northerners in the antebellum period. But when Southerners made the Lost Cause about the home, I think this fed into all the sentimentalized notions about the home that people subscribed to in 19th century America, right? So when people thought about home sweet home, when people thought about the South fighting for its home, well, this was very much in keeping with a very sentimentalized notion of the home. And in the end, who could begrudge a Southern man for fighting for women and home? From an emotional standpoint, I think it seemed far more powerful for Southern men to have fought for their homes than to have fought for something like states' rights. So in that regard, I think the way the Lost Cause was articulated as this fight for home was a way in which Southern women again took center stage in the memory of the Civil War. Northern women, in contrast, had never occupied the same emotional place in the Union cause, either as it was defined during or after the Civil War. The Union struggle, as we have seen, tended to place country above the home, the nation above the family. And while few people, I think, would dispute the worthiness of that cause, few people could feel the same kind of sentimental attachment to that kind of calculation or to the women who were marginalized in the fight for the Union. And all of that, I think, means that even today, when we think about the South and the Civil War, we think about Southern women under siege, we think about Southern women making sacrifices, we think about Southern women defending their homes against invading Yankees. We think, of course, of Scarlett and Melanie. The North, in contrast, has no Scarletts, has no Melanies, it has no glamorous rebel girls, but has only the tens of thousands of women who did the hard but overlooked work of embracing the Union cause and helping to make both the cause of the Union and of emancipation a reality. Thank you. Absolutely.
So we have a few minutes left, so I thought we'd open up the session a little bit for audience. Oh, if you all could just hold your question until the mic gets over to you, Chris.
So just comparing the 2 points that you made when you were talking about the views of the Confederates versus the Union soldiers on the family, it seemed like the Confederates were all about family and the Unions may have been more of like a, the focus more on their country, like you were saying. But it seems when you're talking about the second point, how the Confederates didn't care for the African-American family and they were more out defending what they believed as the family. I wonder if it's not the Union's way of defending what they believe to be an important family rather than just putting their political views above their, I don't know if I'm articulating my question very well, but
So that they had a different idea of what family was, which...
Well, rather than putting their country above their family, if they weren't maybe fighting for what they thought the family needed to be, rather than the Confederate view of a white family is more important than fighting for their country.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, it's tricky because I think some Confederates, some slave-owning Confederates would have said, when they said family, sometimes they even believed they were fighting for a white family and a black family. And some of them even used that phrase, my family white and black. And, sort of had this idea that was kind of a, one large family that they were fighting to defend. I think African Americans would have rejected that, and they wouldn't have agreed that that was their notion of family. But I think some Confederates probably tried to justify, when I say I'm fighting for my family, well, I would define it in that very broad way. But you're right. I mean, whereas Unionists obviously had a very different notion of family. It didn't include slaves. It wouldn't have included servants. It wouldn't have included anything except. Well, I suppose it wouldn't have included anything except the very immediate nuclear family in most cases for Northerners. Does that sort of get to? Yeah, I just wanted to. Yeah, so I think that's true, that they probably, in their heads, family probably, meant two different things.
Just a quick question. I was just curious. After the war and stuff, did Southern women receive a pension for their death?
Sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't. There were some states. Well, a lot of it. The Southern states often didn't have a whole lot of money for distributing for pension benefits. So there was no federal pension policy as far as Confederates were concerned. Although it's possible at some point in the 50s, basically when there was nobody, 1950s, when there was nobody alive anymore to get a pension, there might have been some kind of, honorary thing that the United States Congress did in terms of Confederate pensions. But really, most of the time, so each state, Alabama, Mississippi, whatever, would have had its own pension system that they enacted to give money to Southern widows and, dependents.
I have a question. In regards to the tactics used by Union generals, such as Sherman's March through the South and Grant's use of offensive attacks regardless of casualties, do you think that somewhat tarnished the view of the North, not only in the southern states, but also in the North, in the entire area? And do you feel that may have helped to remove Northern women from
Right.
history?
Well, it's an interesting question because it sort of has to do with, I think you're right, that there has tended to be a kind of sympathy for the southern side for some of the hardships they withstood, and not the same kind of sympathy for the northern side. But I think, and there's been some interesting work on this recently, I think immediately after the war, men like Sherman and Grant were huge heroes, and they were not neglected, and they were very much honored and respected in northern, not southern, but in northern society. And there's a kind of later, evolution of thinking that says, oh, all Grant did was butcher everybody, and all Sherman did was just kind of attack all of these defenseless women and children. I think those are kind of later things that, maybe to some extent were promoted more by historians of the South or other people in sort of defense of the South. But I think immediately after the war was over, men like Grant and Sherman were honored, respected, they were memorialized, tributes were paid to them. And it's possible that, so much was so many honors and statues and whatnot were extended to men like Grant and Sherman that, women who, what did they have to do with it? They didn't really do anything, but it was really those soldiers that did so much.
I actually have two questions. The first one, I know it might be kind of hard to evaluate, but who do you think was better off after the war, Northern women or Southern women, in terms of politics and family life and quality of life?
Well, I think you'd have, it's always hard to kind of say better off because there's all kinds of things that go into being better off. But without question, so much of the infrastructure of the South was undermined, was debilitated, was weakened, that, Southern women had, even those who came from positions of privilege, obviously had a lot to deal with and couldn't, a lot was lost, a lot of property was destroyed, a lot of property was taken away. A lot of adjustments had to be made. In some ways, I think Northern women were better prepared to meet the post-war adjustment period because a lot of them had already gone to work. They were used to, some level of employment. Southern women much less accustomed to the idea of going out to work, and a lot of them, now for the first time have to take on jobs. So I think in terms of material resources, maybe sort of psychologically, Southern women are suffering a lot, and maybe are not in the same position as Northern women. And and in terms of politics, I think the atmosphere in the North was more conducive to talking about, even if the right to vote wasn't granted immediately, there was just more openness to talking about notions of women's rights in the North than there was in the South. Those discussions were still very much kind of, frowned upon, I think, in the South.
My other question, I know you said there were no Scarlett O'Hara types in the North, but if you had to pick like one woman who possibly embodied the ideas of women in the North, who would it be in history?
Well, I don't know that I'd want to. I don't know that I'd want to turn anybody into a Scarlett O'Hara. I don't know. You wouldn't want to make anybody a Scarlett O'Hara. But I sort of think about, I don't know, I guess I think about somebody like Clara Barton, maybe, who, people sort of have heard of Clara Barton. Nobody really knows that much about what she did. But in many ways, she's not typical of the Northern woman's experience because she was a nurse, she was single, she kind of put herself in the middle of the whole war effort. But I think, she made so many kind of critical contributions to what happened that people sort of tend to forget about. She well, I mean, she was a nurse. She wasn't, just a nurse sort of on the sidelines, but she was actually there, say, on the battlefield at Antietam, where she actually, attended to the wounded right there. That was considered sort of something women don't do. Maybe you could be a nurse, but to actually be there where the fighting's taking place, that was something else altogether. She did this incredible thing, actually, at the end of the war that few people know about, of documenting and sort of tabulating the lists of all the Union soldiers who died at Andersonville Prison. And that was huge because, Andersonville Prison had this, what was the death toll? Like 13,000 Union soldiers who died at Andersonville. And all of these families, who were like didn't have records, I know my loved one hasn't come back, but I don't know where he died or what happened to him. And she undertook this kind of massive, it sort of sounds like a bureaucratic thing, but it was an kind of incredible effort to document who all the dead were at Andersonville and then notify, next of kin to say, at least, we know now where your loved one died and get that information out to people.
How do you think all the ideas of family and home that took place then have affected the ideas of family and home now?
Well, that's a good question. I would say we continue to live with a very sentimentalized notion of home. I mean, I think that's something that goes on today. I don't think, well, I mean, then it sort of, obviously I think things have changed in terms of how much we still tend to think of the home simply as woman's sphere. That's undergone some changes, but I think it hasn't, I think we still live with some residue of that, with, a notion that if it's not only woman's sphere, it's sort of principally woman's sphere. So that's a kind of a lasting legacy. I suppose there's some way, too, in which, the notion that Southerners are more attached to their homes and families. We continue to live with that idea that some of this stuff, and maybe it comes from this period, too, and sort of this notion, I'm fighting for my home and my family. We still sort of live with this idea that, well, in the South, especially, they have, family is strong. The values of the home and the family tend to be stronger there than in the rest of the country. I'm kind of speculating, but maybe that's true.
You mentioned in one of your points about the Southern men were fighting for the women in the South. To what degree do you think that it was partly about women, but looking at popular culture and historiography of the period, it seems like racial purity was even more important than the woman. We were trying to preserve racial purity, and that the woman held a sort of an exalted status because she was the important and essential element
In racial
making
purity.
sure that racial purity remained.
Well, I see what you're saying, and I think that you could see, the way all of those things sort of blended together. When Abraham Lincoln was elected in November of 1860, there was this fear in the South that what they called black republicanism had taken over. And black republicanism was going to kind of unleash free blacks on the South. It was going to encourage slaves to not want to be slaves anymore. And one of the things that they kind of come back or Southerners seem to kind of fixate on repeatedly is that when black men are free, the first thing that they're going to do is intermarry with white women. So I think there is a way in which when they talked about we're fighting to protect our homes and our families, sometimes they saw that very literally as meaning the black Republicans are going to set loose black men and the black race on us, and that's going to make, and they're going to and our women are particularly vulnerable, and that we're, so what we have to do is protect them against that. So yeah, I think you're right that those things, the kind of the notion of racial purity and the protection of womanhood did kind of get blended together in their minds.
I'm thinking of that scene, for those of you who've seen Birth of a Nation, there's that scene in the Reconstruction period where the white girl is pursued by a black soldier who sort of looks like Robert De Niro with a really bad sunburn.
Well, because he is a white guy, he's not actually a black actor, he's a white actor with
What
blackface.
does she end up doing but jumping off the cliff and sacrificing herself? So in a way, it's about women, but partly about maintaining racial purity. And if the woman has to sacrifice herself for that, I don't know if that's where B.W. Griffith was going, but I'll bet maybe it was.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, I think, right, and then that idea had a different, I mean, then it sort of resonated in a different way after the war was over. When black men are actually freed, what are going to be the implications of that? We've got to make sure that we protect ourselves against that threat.
Can I just interject that the culture of chivalry or honor in the South, that probably has some connection as well. I mean, if you think about how women represent property, ownership, authority, but that's tied into this concept of honor in the South. So there's there's that connection. If something happens to the woman, that's a direct, sort of slap at honor, at my honor, as a male patriarch of this family, the protector.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And they use that phrase a lot too. That my family's honor, personal honor, is part of what the cause is about.
Time for one more question.
Having done a lot of research into this and having read the letters back and forth between the men and the women, do you feel that one side or the other supported their cause better? Speaking of the women, do you think the northern women or the southern women supported the cause of the nation or supported the war better than the other side?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard, there's different criteria, I guess, for evaluating that. But one thing I'm always struck by, I guess, is, when you read about Southern white women supporting the Confederacy, there's a level of frustration that they have. Because I think a lot of them feel sort of, committed to the idea of the Confederacy, supporting the war effort. But the society had so many put up so many obstacles and had so many ideas about this is proper for a woman to do, this is not right for a woman to do, you shouldn't be out in public, you shouldn't be doing this, that there were so many of those kinds of things that made it hard. So for example, there's a lot of complaints at various points in the South, not enough women are becoming nurses. Because a lot of white women felt like it was degrading to go into a hospital, to do the kind of work that it was expected, to bathe soldiers and strange men and whatever. And, these were degrading things to do. And it was okay, black women could do those things or slaves could do those things. But I think that there was a kind of standard that made it difficult for Southern white women to make the same kinds of contributions, whereas Northern women, yeah, there were some, people might look askance at some of those things, but I don't think they had the same kinds of roadblocks that prevented them from doing those things.
Well, I think with that, we'll call it good. And
Great, terrific.
thanking Dr.
Thank you. Thank you.